welcome. Tonight we're going to meet a local boy, somebody who hasn't gone too far away and is staying even closer to Milford now. Somebody who went to a great school, showing his colors, but somebody I hope you never have to meet on a professional basis. We're going to talk about, well, I'll let you start with an introduction. I'll let you talk about it.
Excellent. So my name is Dr. Patrick McEnaney. I'm one of the surgeons over at Milford Regional Medical Center. And I hail locally from Mendon, as you mentioned, from my colors. I went to Holy Cross. And I'm going to be talking tonight about inguinal hernias, and we could potentially expand on talking about other types of hernias, but with inguinal hernias being so prevalent, I want to spend some time talking to you about those and how we treat those folks.
Now, nobody really knows what a hernia is. It's always you lifted something bad and you hurt yourself. But there's a lot more to it, isn't there?
There is. And what a hernia is when part of your body, and typically it's either fat or intestine, that protrudes from one place to another where it does not belong. And that most commonly results from some kind of hole or defect that has developed over the course of one's lifetime. Now, chances are that hole was there, albeit probably at a smaller size, but some kind of event has happened, whether that be lifting something heavy, or if somebody has a really bad cold and is coughing very aggressively. That's a very common time for individuals to feel like they have caused a hernia. In all honesty, that defect or that hole has probably been there for years, and it just really came to a head during that particular incident event.
But now, when you say a hole, I got plenty of fat. I can point out I got lots of fat, but how would a hole start?
So in males, which are the more common reasons for developing a hernia, males are more likely to develop an inguinal hernia. That is, our testicles originally start inside our abdominal cavity back when we were in the womb.
Come on.
That's where they started. And they actually pass through our abdominal wall down in the groin region before settling into the scrotum. And the wake that is left behind is supposed to actually close down. But about 25% of the time, that does not close down all the way. Now, sometimes that will present at infancy, where a baby or an infant needs to have their hernia fixed right away. Those are hernias that do not require any mesh, that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but sometimes that hole is very, very tiny and small and does not manifest itself in infancy, but rather will declare itself as we age through our years. And over time, that tiny, tiny little hole will gradually get bigger and bigger. And eventually, when we're lifting something heavy, coughing, sneezing, it can start to push some tissue through that hole, which can sometimes cause pain, and sometimes it just causes a bump that individuals can feel. Probably the most common thing that I see is individuals say, I was in the shower and all of a sudden I felt this lump that I never felt before. It's not bothering me, but I just felt it there, and they go see their primary care physician. They diagnose that as a hernia, and then oftentimes they're coming to.
But now, to the layman, you think of a hole. It's not a hole coming through my stomach.
So there actually is a hole in the abdominal wall, and it tends to not be a straight shot, so to speak, but yeah, there's
a real hole that I got to get around the muscle and.
Well, it actually goes. So it typically goes through the muscle. So there's different areas where these holes can develop in the groin. There's actually 4 different locations where holes can form, and you can have a combination of any one of those, or even have all 4 of those.
I never knew my groin was that big to have 4 different.
Some of them are much more rare than others. The most common types of hernias that we see are what we call indirect hernias, But as males age, direct hernias become more prevalent as well. And then a femoral hernia, which is a much more risky type of hernia, because those are ones that are more apt to trap tissue that gets stuck, or what we call incarcerated, which is really the big deal when we talk about hernias. So when tissue pushes through one of those holes, sometimes it can, push in, but then easily go back where it belongs. That's what we call a reducible hernia. If those are not causing any symptoms, then oftentimes we can watch those hernias. But over time, about 75% of people will have some degree of symptoms within their first 2 years.
Now, if it goes through, will it go back on its own, or will you have to push it back?
Sometimes it does require pushing it back in. And depending upon what's pushing through and how much is pushing through, will dictate the ease with which it can get pushed back in, and also how much worry we have about it. So if it's fat pushing through, that's okay as long as it's not terribly symptomatic or causing pain. But when intestine pushes through, that's a different ball.
I mean, if enough of my fat pushed through, you couldn't just shave it and just kind of go in and shave it off and say you don't need that much anyway?
But ultimately, it's a matter of patching that hole. So the goal for surgery is really to patch that hole up and make sure that the tissue that was supposed to stay on one side of that hole stays there. And that's where surgery comes into play.
But now, I mean, all kidding aside, if part of my intestine sneaks through, isn't there a risk that it gets stuck?
Yep, that's what we call incarceration. So if somebody gets incarcerated, like in jail, they get stuck. That intestine can get stuck in there, and if it stays in there too long, it can start to become strangulated, which is even another level of concern that we have. So basically, the blood supply to that piece of intestine in this particular case can become compromised, and if that happens, then sometimes we need to take out that piece of intestine, and therefore the ability to repair the hernia in the way that we want to oftentimes goes out the door, and we have to repair
But
it.
if it comes through and gets incarcerated, it gets strangled, I mean, you're blocking your bowels.
Yep.
How does the Gazinta Gizauda?
So oftentimes when that happens, if the intestine is stuck within there, it can cause a bowel obstruction or a bowel blockage. So it gets harder for things to go from point A to point B.
Right.
And therefore people will get very distended, crampy, bloated, and they'll start vomiting. So that's how it will declare itself. Now, fortunately, that happens infrequently, but it's always the thing that's on the back of our mind, and why it is that we need to explain to individuals who we see in the office the warning signs if we elect to leave things alone and not operate, or sometimes just between seeing them and operating on them, things to watch out for.
Yeah, 'cause I'm just thinking, I mean, blocking your intestinal blockage, there's only a limited period of time that you can go with that.
Yeah, if we see somebody who needs, who ends up having a blockage, we have to take that person to the operating room pretty expeditiously, like that day and within hours if possible.
Wow. If something starts at point A, how long of a trip does it have before it gets to point B?
It depends upon how far down the stream that point B is. So for most inguinal hernias or groin hernias, the piece of intestine that gets stuck is most commonly going to be the colon. But if it's a piece of small intestine, which it can be as well, that's going to be a shorter distance. So if you were to eat food, it doesn't take terribly long before it gets to the colon, perhaps an hour or two. So it doesn't take long for it to get there.
So this is not something you're going to put off for a week or two?
No. Certainly the vast majority of hernias that we see do not fall into the category of getting incarcerated. Those are people who we typically meet in the emergency room because those individuals are absolutely miserable with the crampy abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. the vast, vast majority of people who we see with a hernia just kind of have an ache, perhaps at the end of a day, a long day at work, and have noticed a bulge and are wondering, okay, what's going to happen to this,
So
and what
now,
do I need to do?
when you talk about 4 areas,
Mhm.
I mean, we see the pictures where somehow our hernias become enlarged in the testes, but that's not the most common, is it?
So those 4 areas are very close to one another. So there's a direct space hernia and an indirect hernia. So those are the 2 most common. A femoral hernia is just below that. And again, as I said, that's a very risky hernia to have. Those are far more common in women. And women can still get inguinal hernias as well. I don't want to give the impression that this is just a male phenomenon. That certainly happens to about 25% of males during their lifetime, but about 2% of women will develop hernias.
25% of men get hernias?
At some point during their lifetime, they will have a hernia.
My Lord.
That's why it's a common thing.
So now, what would cause, I mean, I'm thinking of my intestines are up here.
Mhm.
My groin is down here.
So your groin basically starts right about here. But your intestines are bouncing right up against that abdominal wall. They're contained within that. And if there's a hole there, something can just slide and knuckle right on through that hole. And sometimes you can have a portion of the intestine go through, but it hasn't gone through all the way, and so you may not necessarily have a bowel blockage because...
Okay, so you could get part of the intestine kind of squeezing, squeezing on the fire hose, but not obstructing the whole flow.
Correct. And that's what we call a Richter's hernia, and those are still very, very dangerous because it can actually cause the wall of that piece of intestine to actually suffocate and die, and then we're in a whole host of trouble because we have to take out that piece of intestine.
Is it the death of this tissue, or I'd be more worried that it pops open, it squeezes, and all of a sudden now I got a nice sterile area?
Yeah.
Not so much.
Exactly, which is why it is that the way that we like to repair hernias in a much more controlled and clean environment, now we can't use the mesh that we typically utilize to fix hernias because that mesh would undoubtedly get infected. We have to do basically some other makeshift maneuvers, whether it's just stitches or use an absorbable type mesh that ultimately will lead to a hernia recurrence. And we know that, but we've got to make do with the situation that we have.
But do you just flush out the peritoneal cavity? Or?
So again, ultimately, for the rare instances that somebody comes in with an incarcerated hernia, the vast majority of times we're able to get that intestine in, and we do not need to take out the intestine. We still need to fix the hernia, but if there is an actual hole, then yes, we need to try to wash out and irrigate the abdominal cavity because there's a hole in the intestine, and we need to...
Yeah, all the bacteria is going to be very happy living in...
It's going to make you really sick.
Oh, I remember one of the kids on my soccer team, her appendix burst.
Mm-hmm.
And what they had to do to flush her out was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she was a little kid.
Yeah.
Somebody as big as me, they'd be there with they'd have to get 2 East fire truck to come in and flush my insides out.
Yeah, no, it's not something that we like to have to do, which is why it is that the emergency room physicians at Milford Regional Medical Center call us as soon as they have somebody who's got an incarcerated hernia, because we know we let
That's
that
the
go
call
too
from
long.
Jeff Hopkins you don't want to get.
Exactly. 'Cause we gotta get there right away.
Jeff, can't you just call and say hello? So now, I can be born with it.
Yes.
I still can't think of that kind of trip. I don't want to think of that kind of trip. Get punched in the side, it would hurt that much more.
Yeah.
But there's nothing you can do about being born and the path being left open.
Correct. Yep. So that's something you're just born with.
But I read that some of the issues are self-induced.
There are. So the things that can actually expedite hernias, constipation. So if you're straining a lot, you're generating a lot of intra-abdominal force to try to push things out of areas of weakness. Individuals who smoke, who then oftentimes are coughing violently, resultant from that. When they cough, that exerts a tremendous amount of force on their abdominal cavity and therefore can cause hernias to develop.
You know, it's interesting. I just had a bit of a nuisance a little while ago with the quadruple bypass, and I never knew how much force.
Yeah.
Yes, because they gave you the pillow,
Yep.
and at first I said, yeah, I don't need that. And
No,
they
you
said,
need
you'll
Yeah.
learn to love your pillow. And oh my God,
Yeah.
the time that I didn't have the pillow,
Mm-hmm.
it was like I was being cut open again.
Yeah. When you cough or you sneeze, in your case with your sternum, it's trying to pull it apart, you know, and that's why, you know, giving you that squeeze with that pillow helps combat
Yes,
that.
sneezes were not my favorite exercise at that point.
Yes.
One would sneak up on you, and boy,
Yeah.
would you feel it.
Exactly.
So the smoking is really the coughing.
Correct. Correct. And certainly from a wound healing standpoint, we're not a big fan of smoking, period. Smoking is never a good thing from a health standpoint. Anytime we need to fix any kind of hernia, more commonly the ventral hernias, those are the ones, or the ventral meaning front of the abdominal wall. For those that are far more complex, individuals who smoke have a much higher risk of having hernia complications, whether it be infection or recurrence.
Yes, they yelled at me when they say, do you smoke? I said, yes. I said, how many packs? I said, cigar every 4 months. And they're like, well, I guess we can tolerate that. I said, you know, it's like when they ask you, you're a drinker. Yes. What was your last drink? Christmas?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not then just the fact that you're putting extra pressure on from coughing, but you start looking at the weakness of your body to fight off. If it's trying to fight off the effects of smoking, it's not going to have as much energy to dedicate to fighting off your hernia.
Well, the hernia isn't something that your body is going to fight off. Your
It's not
hernia.
going to try and squeeze it back in?
No, it's the hole just kind of exists there on its own, and the tissue is going to protrude through it or not. And a lot of times it's the coughing and other forces, sneezing, heavy lifting, that will push that tissue out. And ultimately that's where surgery comes into play, where we recommend fixing those.
But now if I feel a bump,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a man.
Yep.
I don't have to fix things.
Mm-hmm.
I can live through it. But I mean, it's kind of like when Jeff Hopkins talked to me about having a stroke. And he said, okay, 1 million brain cells a minute.
Mm-hmm.
How many minutes do you want to wait? Kind of hit me that, okay, this is not a time to be a manly man and power through it. If I find a bump, you're saying it doesn't get better on its own.
Correct. A hernia will not fix itself on its own. Now, hernias that are not symptomatic, we can treat conservatively and just watch them, which we can do for smaller hernias, but as they get bigger, and many of them will develop symptoms, those are the ones that we need to embark upon from a surgical standpoint.
But when you say treat them conservatively,
So that basically means that we do not operate. We can still allow people to do their normal everyday things. We don't want to necessarily restrict them per se, because we want people to live their normal human life. But if it turns out that they have to modify in order to do the things to keep this from acting up, well then by definition it's actually symptomatic, and therefore we should intervene surgically.
but if you don't intervene surgically, what else can you do?
So you can, again, if it's small enough and it's not causing any pain and it's not getting bigger and bigger, we can just leave it. And some people who are actually, they might even have bigger hernias that are just not fit to have surgery, those are folks who we leave alone too. Fortunately, that's not terribly common, but we do it on occasion.
How would it be that I'm not fit for surgery if the hernia is growing?
So individuals who have really bad heart disease or lung problems that are not going to be able to tolerate.
Oh, the surgery.
Correct. Surgery, as straightforward as this operation can be, it's still an operation. It's not just a walk in the park.
You still have the anesthesiologist and
Exactly. Yeah. And anytime, when we go through our lives, we trek along our certain pathway, and then there's going to be some insult, and whether that's a car accident or surgery for a hernia repair, it takes you down a notch, and it's going to take some time for you to bounce back to where you were before. And the less healthy you are coming into the picture, the deeper that fall, and you're probably at a lower level to basically start, and it's going to take a longer period of time for you to recover. And this is the art of medicine and surgery, is really figuring out who's going to tolerate an operation and who's not going to tolerate an operation.
But now, when we talk about surgery, okay, I got something sticking out, an out damn spot, get back in there. But you're going to have people like me with a lot of fat on top of what little muscle I have, and then the intestines behind it. What is the surgery like?
So surgery can be approached in primarily one of two ways. So we can do it in an open fashion or in a minimally invasive fashion, and each of them have advantages and disadvantages. Now, the way that we have done it in the early years was an open incision, where we would make a small cut in the groin to dissect down to where that hole is and basically put a patch on from the inside. We used to use some plugs, although the data would indicate that we should not be putting in any more plugs. We should just be using a patch for the hernia. So that is one option. The alternative is to tackle it minimally invasively, where through typically 3 small incisions, they're typically on the upper portion of the abdomen, we can basically fix the hernia from the inside, what we call laparoscopically. And with the addition of the robot that we have at the hospital, we can actually now utilize the robot to essentially give our straight stick laparoscopic instruments wrists. We've got 3D visualization, so we've actually got a
Da Vinci's good, huh?
Yeah, it gives us a very, very beautiful.
Say better be for what Uncle Ed paid for it.
For sure. But one of the advantages of doing it minimally invasively is a faster recovery. In addition, the hernia dissection that we need to do internally exposes all 4 of those areas that we talked about, whereas when we do it open, it really targets primarily 2 of the hernias, the direct and indirect, and therefore the laparoscopic route.
Now, again, when you talk about 4, there's not that much room down there.
So the size of the mesh that we typically put in is either a large or an extra large piece of mesh, so it's about that big.
You're kidding.
Nope. No, it's a pretty sizable piece of mesh because it needs to cover enough areas where those holes develop, but also the mesh cannot be too small, otherwise that mesh could fall into that hole. In other words, if I...
Oh, okay. You can't put a little tiny patch.
Right. It's just going to fall into the hole. So therefore, the wider the surface area, the more it's going to hold on its periphery.
Now, when you hear about some of the issues with vaginal mesh, with the tissue, going through the mesh, or becoming, I don't know how to even put it, part of the mesh. Don't you have the same problem?
Not for this type of hernia repair. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the news, or at least seeing commercials with there being issues with mesh. The most important thing with mesh is making sure that you choose the right type of mesh and it's placed well and in the right space. without those three critical components, then any foreign body, whether it's a mesh, a tack, or any other prosthetic, is going to cause some
Well, the
degree of
body
problems.
is going to look and try and mount a foreign body
It does.
reaction.
It is a foreign body, and so therefore it is going to it's going to create a scar there. Now, there has been a lot of research in trying to create the best kind of mesh, but ultimately every mesh is going to have some degree of reaction. It's just a matter of trying to find the one that is going to be the
But
right
won't the body
one.
try and encapsulate it, or?
It actually does. So but if it encapsulates it and it sandwiches the mesh in such a fashion that it still covers the holes and does not cause any symptoms such as chronic pain, then that encapsulation is doing
That's
exactly
actually-
what the body's supposed to do.
Then that'll help you.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering, because when you pick a mesh,
Mhm.
I mean, there's pore size, there's
Yep.
the material.
Yep.
I mean, it's all medical grade,
Mhm.
some kind of polyolefin or something,
so
but.
the most common type of mesh that we utilize for this is a polypropylene.
Mhm.
And there was a recent study that actually came out that showed that the more macroporous mesh is just as good as utilizing the more microporous mesh, although many of us for larger hernias will still use the more microporous mesh only because it's stiffer, and ultimately for a larger hernia with the more macroporous mesh that is much more pliable, it just has a higher risk of dropping down into that larger hole.
I hadn't thought about that. I always worried about, the tissue just going through.
So we want it to actually grow through some of those pores. So the macroporous mesh is those
So it
pores
serves
are
a
there.
better anchor?
So it does two things. One is it allows for better tissue ingrowth because it can grow in between those the fabric, so to speak, of the mesh. But also, even from an infection standpoint, a macroporous mesh is much easier to fight off infection, which fortunately is very, very rare for inguinal hernia. As a matter of fact, when we do our surgery minimally invasively, and even open, as long as it's not recurrent, we don't need to give antibiotics.
Really?
Yeah, we don't. No, the data from the World Health Organization that just published a big, basically a big series, had indicated that we do not need to give prophylactic antibiotics for open inguinal hernias that are not recurrent. They're given basically for bilateral opens, a recurrent inguinal hernia in an open fashion, but for our minimally invasive hernias, we don't need to give any prophylactic antibiotics for those.
Well, in a way, it kind of makes sense. You are going into a sterile field,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you don't introduce bacteria.
Correct. I mean, that's why we have to do it in the main operating room and make sure we maintain sterile technique the entire time.
Yeah, because I was going to say, aseptic technique's got to be critical. Because, boy, you could really set off a chain reaction if you
Yep.
introduce bacteria in the cavity.
Without a doubt. And that, fortunately, is
Still can't
so
get over
rare.
that big of a...
It's
Still,
it's
seems
Yeah.
huge.
I wish I had brought one with me to show you.
Oh, no, there's certain things I don't need to see.
Got it.
So, besides the groin area,
Mm-hmm.
where else do hernias pop up?
Okay. So, as far as those that I deal with from a general surgery standpoint, so people will talk about hiatal hernias, which is a hole in the diaphragm where the esophagus pushes through. So, our GI tract, mouth, esophagus, stomach. Our stomach is below our diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the muscle that separates our chest cavity from our abdominal cavity. And there's a hole in that diaphragm that's purposefully there to allow the esophagus to pass. And when people have a hiatal hernia, which is also very common, some of the stomach can now protrude through a larger opening in that diaphragm. And as more and more of the stomach pushes up into the chest, the issues that can arise resultant from that may require surgery. Some people will just experience heartburn more regularly with the most common type of hiatal hernia, what we call a type 1 hiatal hernia. But with the increased amount of CAT scans that are done in this day and age, we see now a lot of what we call type 3 hiatal hernias, what we call a paraesophageal hernia, where there's a lot more of the stomach that's up in the chest and is now starting to twist and turn. And just like you can get a bowel blockage in the groin from intestine kinking into a hole, the stomach's already up there, but it can twist within the space that it is living.
So I was always amazed when I saw some of the surgical techniques for esophageal cancer, where they do a pull-up.
Yep.
And it just, I mean, only that much, but I would imagine that puts an incredible strain if you're pulling up your whole stomach.
So for that type of surgery, certainly the stomach is tubularized, and it basically gets its blood supply from one of the 4 major blood vessels that it typically gets its blood supply from, but that can actually mobilize quite well into the chest cavity in order to make a connection to the normal esophagus to get rid of that esophageal cancer.
Wow. It's amazing. Now, you mentioned ephemeral is very dangerous.
Correct.
Oh, I mean, you messing around down here, I think it's
Okay.
dangerous anyway.
Yep.
Just emotionally.
Yep.
But what makes it so much more dangerous than?
So it happens to be the hernia that is more apt to trap a piece of intestine and not let it go. So, and because they're smaller, they tend to grab tissue again and not let it out. Whereas a bigger hernia, if you have a big hole, tissue can go in easily.
It can squidge.
Yeah, it can go in easily, which means it can fall out easily. But if it's really tiny hole, that's where folks can get into trouble much more quickly. So those are the hernias that even if we discover them radiographically, we fix those even if they're asymptomatic, because they will cause a problem.
Now, you're saying if it's asymptomatic, you just have to watch it. But you see the horror stories where, somebody's testes all of a sudden becomes a basketball because it reminds me of like when your roof leaks and the water can just travel.
So it's pretty rare to have a hernia grow that dramatically over such a short period of time. And for the individuals who we do treat conservatively, they're still seeing us and or their primary care physician on a regular basis to make sure that it's remaining quiescent. And certainly if that changes, then we end up fixing that.
So when you try and fix them, you're trying to get in there, put the mesh on. What holds the mesh down?
So we will sometimes stitch it or tack it into place, but sometimes we don't even need to do that if we do it minimally invasively, that is, because when we expose the area that we need to cover, the mesh has a certain contour that's similar to the shape of the pelvis and the lower abdominal wall, such that when we close up the lining of the abdominal cavity that had been opened in order to expose those holes or hole, it basically creates a sandwich. So your peritoneum, or the lining of your abdominal cavity, if you think of it as a sandwich, is one piece of bread. The mesh is your piece of turkey or roast beef. And then the abdominal wall with its holes are the other side.
So the pressure will hold it together.
Yeah, so that same intestine that was pushing up and sliding through the hole now holds the mesh there.
Now, if I've got this mesh in me, do I have to really modify my behavior, or?
So initially we want to make sure that you've got appropriate pain control and that there's appropriate time for the mesh to get incorporated into the tissues, and usually that takes about 6 weeks. Now, does that mean that you can't do anything for 6 weeks? No, it just means that you need to be careful about some of the overexertional activities. So when I see a patient who has had a hernia repair, depending upon where that hernia is, I will tailor what it is that I allow them to do during their recovery period. But with the minimally invasive approach, I typically ask them for the first 2 weeks to really kind of take it easy. But then after
when I had that nuisance of the quad bypass,
Mhm.
they wouldn't let me lift more than 10 pounds
Yeah.
for, I think it was 2 months.
Yeah, that's because of the work that your pectoral muscles do on your sternum, and the more you do, you could
Pull it.
pull apart.
Oh,
your
you
sternum.
learned real quick
Yeah.
that if you abuse that, there were
Mhm.
certain things that when, don't get insulted, when the physician told me don't,
Yeah.
no, I'm a man, I can ignore him. And when I do, yo,
Yeah.
no, I shouldn't.
Yeah, and you got to be careful because some people who want to try to, be the tough guy will.
Well,
take
I
it
mean,
over.
I learned day 2 when I tried on my side
Mm.
and the plates come together. Yes, I woke up real fast.
Yep.
Now, we keep talking about men, but women go through a much more traumatic shock period, or
Yeah.
you want to say force vector,
Yep.
when they're having children. And you see how many people end up with laps,
Mhm.
the vaginal laps, the colon.
Mhm.
How come they don't get hernias?
So women absolutely develop hernias. As far as inguinal hernias, they're less likely to develop them relative to men just because of the differences in how we developed back in the womb. But undoubtedly women...
Oh yeah, they didn't have those little guys blazing a path.
Exactly. But ultimately, women who become pregnant, they stretch their abdominal wall. And one of the other most common areas for hernias to develop, which will commonly declare itself for many women during pregnancy, is an umbilical hernia. Now,
The Audi.
exactly. It looks like a doorbell. But interesting enough, that is one of the rare times where a hernia can actually close up on its own. So we see this actually in infants. So for example, my granddaughter had an umbilical hernia, and many of those will close up on their own, and hers had closed up, and so she did not require surgery. Women who are
Wait a
pregnant.
minute, granddaughter,
Yes.
you graduated what class? You're not
Yeah,
old
I
enough to have a granddaughter.
I have a beautiful 3-year-old granddaughter.
Oh, now my granddaughter's 3 months, and I'm much older than you. I guess they didn't have cable TV in West Boylston.
My 2 girls are technically my stepdaughters, but they are my girls. I love them to pieces, and they are.
We've had that debate on this show about, okay, who's the real father? 30 seconds of glory or 20 years of dedication. I know who I vote for.
20 years of dedication.
20 years of dedication.
Yeah.
And my hat comes off to people who do realize they're marrying not just their darling bride, but the kids that come with it.
Yep.
We had a
Absolutely.
mother on our soccer team, and she got married for the second time, and her husband, you couldn't tell. They absolutely, he adored the kids, they adored him. You couldn't ask for, a more dedicated set of parents. And you could see it in the kids, because the kids were just wonderful.
I couldn't ask for 2 better daughters. So.
Plus, being a father, I'll get in trouble for being sexist, but having daughters is wonderful.
It is. I've got my 2 girls, I've got 2 boys, and now I've got.
Well, you
my
got
granddaughter.
allies. See, I lived in an
So.
estrogen palace. There was my sainted mother, my darling bride, and 2 ungrateful offspring. But the good news was, when the estrogen war started, junior year high school, they never picked on me.
Yeah.
I was the dad. They always took care of me. My darling bride had to suffer through all that. So now, kids are born with it, you're saying?
Yeah, so kids can be born with hernias. Probably the most common places are the belly button and the groin. The groins, those are ones that would not go away, and those, if they declare themselves, would get fixed as an infant. But at the belly button, that is an area that can potentially close up on its own. And so it's only when, if they're getting to their, to the preschool kindergarten year, if it's still present, that's the time when it'll get fixed.
Well, I would think that's the time when they're going to put the most stress on it.
Yeah, and ultimately it's given at the college, try to close up on its own, and it's not going to close.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you know, when the kid's 2, 3 years old, my grandson is just starting to play soccer.
Yeah.
Up until now, it's been, you know, run around the house or something. Yeah. It's cute, but not a lot of stress. But I can see it starting now.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So you get them in the belly button. You hope that they'll close up.
Yeah.
If not, besides, take your finger, push it back in. What do you do?
So for infants and kids, typically it's just stitches. We do not use mesh for kids because they've got their growth to go through, and the mesh does not stretch with them. So it's really just a matter of putting in stitches. Now, if you had an inguinal hernia as an infant, it does have the potential to come back later on in life, but not necessarily. I've fixed many people who have had developed a hernia on the other side, so to speak, and taken a look in laparoscopically, and that side is still holding up strong. So it's not necessarily going to come back.
But even surgery, the way you're talking, if you're using Mr. Da Vinci there, that's usually a pretty quick recovery time.
It is. So I tell folks it's about a week to 10 days before they feel like they're hitting their stride, but some people will literally go back to work the next day. That all kind of depends upon what their work profile is, but we try to make sure that we have Tylenol as the foundation of our pain control, in large part because of the opioid crisis. Yeah. And a lot of us now are actually prescribing so few narcotics for our operations that we're
found out
put a dent in that.
During that whole nuisance period, they gave me a 5 milligram oxy. And they did the surgery. I cannot talk more or higher praise than I went to Milford Hospital. Next thing I know, the next day, I got 4 tubes, 4 bypasses in my chest. The only thing they didn't come through on was pain. Really didn't have any pain. Friday, they did it Thursday afternoon. Friday, I had to take the day off. So I had tubes. And Saturday, my surgeon wasn't happy because he came into the ICU. I'm on my computer, and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm following doctor's orders." And he said, "I didn't tell you to go back to work." I said, "You said reduce stress." I'm not stressed when I'm on my computer. But it was amazing because the way they did it, I really thought I was going to go through a heck of a lot of pain. But somehow they skipped the pain on me, which was nice because by Sunday I was back to work. I couldn't drive, so I had to do it from home. And stayed away. I was just scared to death after doing shows on the effects of oxy and the opioids.
Yep. We're a lot more attentive to those details, and certainly having things like Tylenol and the nonsteroidals be the foundation, and then adding on the opioids if need be, and not have those be the first line of defense and then add the Tylenol afterwards. So we've really changed our philosophy around, which is ideally going to put a big dent in the opioid crisis and really treat pain the appropriate way that we should have been doing long ago.
Again, you hear about the physicians who abuse it, the 1% or 0.5% that are making money on it, but I got to believe 99.9% just didn't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand that 1 to the 0.5%. That's just went into the wrong career.
Well, that's the amazing part. Today you make a good living, but for what you put in, physicians don't make enough. You can go into a nice business environment, make a good living, and not have anywhere near the stress or the responsibility.
Yeah, it's certainly a stressful career, but one that I gain so much reward from the looks on my patients' faces when they're happy with their outcome and
if
they're
you
doing
have
well.
a passion for it, And you know, so many kids up at school, you know, up at the Cross, that they're hitting junior year and they're trying to decide, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I say, do you have a passion for medicine? If you do, there's no better career.
Absolutely.
But if you don't, go find something else. Use
Mhm.
your chemistry or biology degree.
Yeah.
You don't need to be a physician to make a good living.
Correct.
And
And if you, and in all honesty, if you're going into medicine for the money, you chose the wrong.
well,
wrong
that's
area.
my point. It's saying, if
Exactly.
you got a passion for it,
Yep.
go for it.
Yep.
Now you start off in West Boylston.
Yep.
So you went 8 miles to Holy Cross.
Yeah.
That wasn't a far trek. Then what?
Then I went to UMass.
I was going to say, don't tell me you went to UMass.
I did. I went there for medical school and went directly from college to medical school, and then stayed on to do my residency and fellowship training, which was a total of 7 years. I did a year of research, which was supposed to be 2 years. My principal investigator had gone to Vanderbilt. He was a phenomenal surgeon. It would have, with his departure, it would have meant doing 2 additional years. And at that point, you know, I had my family that I was taking care
At
of on
that
a
point, you're
residency.
saying, do I retire or do
Yeah. Yeah, on a residence salary, trying to help raise my family was becoming financially difficult. So I ended up going back into my clinical years and ultimately graduated from my fellowship in 2005.
Well, I've been amazed when I talk to kids that we went to school, kids, they're 60 years old now, but friends that went to school.
Mm-hmm.
And when they start explaining, okay, Holy Cross is 60-some thousand a year.
Now 70.
Yeah.
Yeah, 69, I think. is the last-
69.
Yeah.
Then you put in med school, and then you kind of, okay, residency and all, maybe you're surviving. But he said, by the time I got out, and he was ophthalmic surgeon, he had to put in now $500,000 for a practice. He says, I'm $1 million in the hole before I can collect my first dollar.
Yep. I just finished paying off my medical school loans just last October. So, and I graduated in 1998, so it took me 20 years to pay off my medical school loans. And in all honesty, when I finished my fellowship, again, as a resident, you're not making a whole lot of money, and ultimately when you're raising 4 kids at the same time, you don't have a lot to sock away. So whereas many of us come out to, or if we're going to buy a house, you got to put down 20%. I could barely scrape together 5%. So I had to get 2 mortgages. I had to pay that off as well, which fortunately is that second mortgage that was a higher rate is done, but it's a chore.
That was like the first month after I paid my daughter was cheap, $5,000 a month. It was only $60,000 when she was there. It's not 69.
Yeah,
But I remember that first month when I didn't have to write that check.
yeah.
I was like, ooh, I just got a big raise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, how did Uncle Phil get you here?
So when
Except for the
Yeah.
purple. Obviously, he looks for purple.
So ultimately, when I was in my fellowship, I was asked by my chairman, who had been in communications at the time with Frank Saba and with Ed, to see, can we provide advanced laparoscopy at Milford Regional Medical Center? And so he had earmarked me to basically to be that person to come down and provide surgical services. So I started here back in 2005, and I've made it my home and have every intention of being here for as long as they'll have me.
That's the amazing part. I lost my mother about a year ago. About 11 years ago, she had intestinal cancer. And one of the physicians, Dr. Cadis, who she would never call, it was Dr. Mona. There was something comforting to, my mother, who was 80-some when she was diagnosed with cancer, but up until 94 years old, going every 6 months to see Dr. Mona. It was the same person. You know, and as I look through the staff at Milford Regional, people stay forever.
Yep. Because it's a great place to be.
I mean, we always joke about the Little Red Hospital, because when I was growing up, I was born in Milford Hospital. It was the Little Red Hospital. Right across the parking lot through the Portuguese picnic was my house. So I didn't go very far either. What would you tell people? You know, you got kids who are trying to make up their mind. Do I go into basically indentured servitude for 7 years? What would you say to them, plus and minus of going into medicine?
So first and foremost, if it is a passion of yours like we talked about, then it's going to be an easy choice for you. Where it is that you decide to go once you're in that field, whether it's primary care, whether it's a subspecialty, that is something that you'll figure out as you're navigating those waters. If you're not passionate about it, then definitely not the area to choose. And ultimately, with a lot of the proposed potential changes in healthcare, how things are going to look, 10 to 15 years from now could be very different than how things are right now. And so it would be a difficult landscape to really read. But I would be very confident to say that physicians aren't going to be making lots and lots of money. Now, we do still need to pay off all the loans that we ended up taking on. So until the day comes that it's free to go to medical school and college to get to that end point, there needs to be that return on investment. And again, I love what I do, and I don't need to be paid tons of money, but I do need to take care of my family.
Well, you probably still have those ungrateful offspring that want to eat every day and have clothes.
Yep, and I need to send them to college too now.
God, that's a scary movie.
Yeah.
I mean, I just started thinking about my grandson, who's 3. What will lacrosse cost when we want to put him through in 18 years or 15 years? It's unbelievable. Now, you obviously had a choice of where to practice.
Yes.
I mean, even Worcester, much bigger than Milford. What brought you here?
So the most important thing for me was being able to provide advanced laparoscopy services across multiple service lines. When you work at an academic medical center, oftentimes you get pigeonholed and carved into just doing, 1 or 2 things, which after a while can probably get pretty boring. Whereas at Milford Regional Medical Center, I get to provide a much wider spectrum of care, and ultimately, I feel like because the patients want to stay there and I can continue to provide that care for them while I'm there, that we both see it as our home, and I have a better time taking care of them.
Yeah, that was the one thing. I mean, I was intimidated when they wheeled me into the Brigham and I was in Bay 82. It's like, okay, wait a minute, get me back to Milford Hospital where I can yell, Jeff, help me. You knew, I mean, half the people you end up knowing, just.
True, but I would also like to say that there's many things that Milford Regional Medical Center does so well because it doesn't try to do every single thing. We're not going to become a cardiac surgery hospital, and therefore, when individuals need cardiac surgery, you got to go to the places that do it well.
But you would have never known. I can speak unfortunately from experience, but I went in and did my stress test, and everything was going fine till I sat down, and then problems, and they say, get the cardiologist. But it was almost seamless. The next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance. I didn't even check in. They had me right into the cath lab, and the next day, I'm having surgery. 3 days later, I'm home. So I felt, anybody who tells me that you can't get the same medical care in Milford, I'm going to tell them I don't believe it. Because I couldn't have asked for better. I got a fantastic surgeon within an hour of going into Milford Hospital.
Yep.
So, for me, you can't complain about why I went to Milford Hospital and how they took care of me, because they got to a point where they said, okay, I remember the cardiologist said, I could do a cath on you, but I don't stent. So rather than stick you, say, yep, you need a stent, and then make you go in again, we're just going to send you to the Brigham and do it all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I only found out later that the stents weren't going to work.
Yeah. Hence why you had the quadruple
Hence
bypass.
why we had the quadruple, yes. But, it's amazing, the environment. And I love the fact that we keep our physicians. And, a lot of it, I'd say, is the recruitment activities.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best things I think we ever did is align ourselves with UMass, because we seem to get great people who want to stay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think Milford Regional Medical Center has a tremendous affiliation with larger academic medical centers between UMass, Brigham and Women's, Boston Children's. So we're able to provide comprehensive care, and when the pathology exceeds that which we can manage and deal with it at our hospital, we know exactly where to send.
Well, it's pretty amazing when you think we've got our second linear accelerator.
Yeah.
Those things are rationed. The fact that we get two, forget the $10 million.
Yeah.
They had to throw Ed out of his office because they wanted the space. But, it's an amazing investment by a Dana-Farber, by Brigham's, in Milford. And I'll come out and say it. I think most of it, I won't say most of it, a large part of it is people like you, the physicians who care enough.
Thanks, Al.
So, well, thank you for everything you do.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And as always, get to know Milford Regional. I can speak from my own experience. You're not going to get better. They're amazing that they do so well at what they know how to do, and then they've made alliances. I was gone in an hour. Within an hour of them making the decision, I'm at the Brigham with one of the best surgeons around. Can't ask for better. And as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, thanks for joining. God bless, and may tomorrow be a healthier day than today.
Not too long since I've been home. Been running all my life just searching for my soul.